Sir, is that some kind of antique? The question, sharp with youthful condescension, sliced through the morning silence at Camp Pendleton's precision shooting range. Lance Corporal Jackson, barely 21 with the swagger that came from top scores in sniper school, gestured dismissively toward the elderly man's rifle case. Frank Rivera, 79 years old, and wearing the simple khaki uniform of base maintenance staff, didn't acknowledge the mockery. His weathered hands, scarred by decades of honest work, remained steady as he carefully arranged his shooting mat on the concrete firing line. The custodial cart he'd pushed to the range sat forgotten behind him, its cleaning supplies a stark contrast to the high-tech weapons surrounding him. Maintenance probably got confused about range schedules, muttered Private Collins, checking his watch with theatrical impatience. Old-timers supposed to be mopping floors, not playing sniper. Their rifles were marvels of modern military engineering, black polymer stocks festooned with rails and accessories, scopes that cost more than most people's cars, bipods that adjusted with the precision of surgical instruments. Frank's rifle, when he finally removed it from its worn canvas case, looked like it belonged in a museum. It was a Springfield M21 wood and steel from an era when wars were fought with simpler tools and harder men. The walnut stock was dark with age and careful maintenance, bearing honest scars that spoke of serious use. The scope mounted above was vintage Redfield glass, scratched and worn but maintained with obvious devotion. Jackson's squad erupted in barely suppressed laughter. "Check the serial number on that thing," one whispered. "Probably saw action with Daniel Boone. Range safety should check his eyesight, not just his rifle," another added. "Can he even see the targets from here?" Frank began his methodical preparation, seemingly oblivious to the ridicule surrounding him. He adjusted his shooting mat with practiced precision, checked his rifle's action with movements that spoke of muscle memory earned over decades. Every motion was economical, purposeful, the kind of efficiency that only comes from a lifetime of repetition. The all-Marine competition was supposed to showcase the Corps' finest marksmen. To these young Marines, Frank Rivera was an embarrassment, a confused old janitor who'd wandered into their elite world by mistake. "That scope's probably got more dust inside than glass," Collins continued, emboldened by his audience. "Bet he hasn't cleaned it since the Carter administration." Jackson stood up from his shooting position, his voice carrying across the range with calculated authority. "Range officer, I've got a safety concern. That competitor's equipment looks like it could misfire. Frankly, it looks dangerous." The entire firing line fell silent. A direct challenge to another shooter's gear was serious business. Master Gunnery Sergeant Torres, the range's iron-faced supervisor, was obligated to investigate any safety complaint. His boots crunched on gravel as he walked down the line, every step echoing in the sudden quiet. He stopped beside Frank's mat, his expression professionally neutral but clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Sir," Torres said, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in the Corps, "I need to inspect your weapons system. Safety complaint." Frank slowly rose from his shooting position, his movements careful but dignified. There was no anger in his dark eyes, no embarrassment at being singled out, just the patient weariness of a man who had endured worse things than the mockery of children. He picked up the M21 and handed it to Master Gunnery Sergeant Torres with the kind of reverence reserved for sacred objects. Torres took the rifle, immediately noticing its surprising weight and perfect balance. The bolt worked with a smoothness that spoke of meticulous maintenance. The trigger broke clean and crisp. The barrel, though showing wear, was immaculate inside, not a trace of corrosion or neglect. This wasn't some forgotten relic gathering dust in an attic. This was a precision instrument, maintained by someone who understood its true nature. Torres examined the scope, squinting through the vintage glass. The lenses were crystal clear, the reticle sharp and properly aligned. Scratches marked the housing, but they were the honest scars of field use, not damage from neglect. "She's sighted in, Master Guns," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the soft accent of East LA. "She'll do what needs doing." Torres found no safety violations. The rifle was sound, even exemplary in its maintenance, but the pressure from Jackson's complaint and the expectant stares of the other Marines weighed heavily on his decision. "Weapon checks out," he announced to the firing line, his voice betraying reluctant respect. "But it's non-standard equipment." "Sir, you may proceed, but any malfunction, any issue at all, and you're immediately disqualified." As Frank accepted his rifle back, his thumb brushed across a deep gouge in the scope's housing, a jagged scar near the windage turret that had been carefully filled and refinished but never fully erased. For a moment, the bright California sunshine faded. The The smell of gun oil and fresh-cut grass was replaced by the thick, oppressive humidity of triple-canopy jungle. The distant pop of training rifles became the deadly whisper of incoming sniper fire and the gut-wrenching explosions of mortar rounds. He was 19 again, his cheek pressed against this same walnut stock, his eye focused through this same scope. The gouge wasn't there yet. That would come later, from shrapnel that missed his head by inches during the siege of Firebase Charlie. A voice echoed across 40 years, his spotter Danny Morales, a kid from Phoenix who could find humor in hell itself. Easy does it, Frank. Make it count, Herman. The memory vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving behind the cold focus that had kept him alive through 13 months in the jungle, the kind of stillness that came from knowing that missing meant good Marines. He settled back into his prone position, the familiar weight of the M21 a comfort against his shoulder. The humiliation was a physical presence now, but it couldn't touch the place where his real strength lived, the place forged in fire and tempered by law. Behind the firing line, in the small set of bleachers reserved for VIPs, a man watched with growing recognition and mounting anger. Retired Colonel Marcus Webb sat rigidly in the observation area, his civilian clothes unable to disguise the ramrod posture of a career Marine. At 65, he carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, his steel-gray eyes missing nothing as they tracked the confrontation unfolding below. Webb had come to watch the competition out of professional curiosity, but something about the elderly janitor had caught his attention. The man's movements, his rifle handling, the way he prepared his position. It all spoke of training that went far beyond amateur enthusiasm. When the custodian had revealed his rifle, Webb felt a chill of recognition. An M21 Springfield, the precision weapon of choice for Marine snipers in Southeast Asia. He'd carried one himself during his tour in Vietnam, and he knew the kind of men who'd mastered that particular rifle. The name Rivera meant nothing to most people, but Webb had spent years studying the classified records of Marine Corps snipers. He'd read files that officially didn't exist, seen after-action reports that told stories of impossible shots and miraculous saves. As he watched the young Marines mock the old man, Webb's jaw clenched with barely controlled rage. These kids had no idea what they were dealing with, not just the rifle, but the man behind it. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he needed. The call was answered on the first ring. Base Operations, Colonel Patterson speaking. Jim, this is Marcus Webb. I need you to run a name through the classified personnel files, verification only. No details over the phone. Webb, what are you doing calling on official channel? You've been retired for 5 years. This is important, Jim. The name is Frank Rivera, currently on your base. I need to know if he's who I think he is. There was a pause, the sound of typing in the background, then silence. When Patterson spoke again, his voice was tight with Jesus Christ, Marcus, where are you right now? Range 7, watching your Marines humiliate a living legend. Get him to stop, right now. I'm calling the base commander immediately. This is a code red heritage situation. Webb ended the call and stood up, his hands shaking with adrenaline and fury. 40 years of military bearing couldn't quite contain his rage at what he was witnessing. Down on the firing line, Frank Rivera had settled into his shooting position, oblivious to the cavalry that was about to arrive. The M21 looked like an extension of his body, natural and practiced in a way that spoke of thousands of rounds fired in circumstances these young Marines couldn't imagine. The range officer's whistle pierced the air. Shooters, you may commence firing when ready. A series of sharp cracks echoed down the line as the Marines began their strings of fire. Jackson, eager to humiliate the old man, sent 5 quick rounds downrange, his electronic target displaying a respectable grouping. He looked over at Frank's lane with a smug grin. The old janitor hadn't fired yet. Frank Rivera lay motionless behind his M21, the world contracted to the small circle of magnified clarity at the end of his vintage scope. The target, 1,000 yards downrange, wavered in the heat shimmer like a mirage from another lifetime. He wasn't seeing paper anymore. He was seeing the jungle clearing, where Sergeant Martinez had pinned down a North Vietnamese sniper who'd been picking off Marines for 3 days. Where one shot meant the difference between his brothers going home alive or in body bags. "Hey, Gramp," Jackson called out, his voice carrying clearly across the range. "You planning to shoot that museum piece or just admire it? Better hurry before visiting hour's end." The breach of range etiquette was stunning. Master Gunnery Sergeant Torres spun around, his face darkening with anger. "Jackson, mind your lane. Final warning." But Frank didn't hear them. The decades had dissolved. He felt the subtle pressure change against his cheek that meant wind shift. Calculated drop and drift, with intuition earned through 13 months of life-or-death precision. His breathing slowed until the world seemed to slow with it. The M21's trigger broke like glass. The crack of the old Springfield was different from the modern rifles. Sharper, more authoritative, carrying the echo of battles fought when the stakes were absolute. The brass case ejected in a perfect arc, glinting in the California sun before landing on the concrete with a musical ring. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the electronic target display flickered to life. Perfect 10. Dead center bullseye. But it was more than that. The computer system, measuring shot placement to thousandths of an inch, registered something that made the range officer do a double take. The shot wasn't just center, it was so precisely centered it appeared to have gone through the exact same hole as some previous shot fired decades ago. That's when the sound reached them. Engines, multiple vehicles moving fast across the desert, emergency lights flashed in the distance, a convoy of command cars and military police vehicles racing toward the range like the world was ending. They didn't slow for the parking area. The vehicles drove directly onto the grass behind the firing line, doors flying open before they'd fully stopped. Out stepped Base Commander General Patricia Hayes, her uniform immaculate, despite the urgent response, her face a mask of controlled fury. She was followed by Colonel Patterson and a phalanx of senior NCOs, their combined presence transforming the atmosphere from casual competition to national emergency. The shooting stopped. The entire range fell into stunned silence as hundreds of Marines watched two-star General stride past them as if they were furniture, her ice-blue eyes locked on one target. Frank Rivera was slowly pushing himself up from his shooting mat, the M21 cradled in his arms like something precious. When he saw the general approaching, something flickered in his weathered features, not surprise but recognition. The look of a man who'd been expecting this moment for a very long time. General Hayes stopped 3 feet in front of him and executed the sharpest, most perfect salute of her distinguished career. Staff Sergeant Rivera, General Hayes's voice carried across the silent range with the full authority of command. It is an honor to have you on our range. The collective gasp from the assembled Marines was audible. Staff Sergeant, not janitor, not civilian, not confused old man. Staff Sergeant, a rank that commanded respect from every Marine present. Frank slowly, carefully came to attention, his movements betraying the arthritis that 4 decades had brought but maintaining the bearing that no amount of time could erase. He returned the general's salute with precision that belonged in a manual. Colonel Patterson stepped forward, tablet in hand, his face grim. Lance Corporal Jackson, he barked. Front and center, now. Jackson stumbled forward, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. The young Marine who'd been so eager to humiliate an old janitor now faced a 2-star general whose expression could have frozen hellfire. For the education of those who have forgotten what the uniform means, Patterson began, his voice cold enough to cut steel. Let me tell you who you've been disrespecting. He consulted his tablet, though it was clear he was reading from memory. Frank Rivera, enlisted Marine, served Republic of Vietnam, 1st Marine Division, 1st Battalion, 4th Marines, participated in Operation Hickory, Operation Niagara and the Siege of Sanh. The legendary battle names hung in the air like thunder. Every Marine present knew those names from their history classes, but to hear them attached to the man they'd been mocking was surreal. Staff Sergeant Rivera was awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in action. Patterson continued. When his Firebase was overrun and his commanding officer killed, he maintained sniper overwatch for 36 hours, eliminating enemy positions that threatened Marine evacuation helicopters. Frank's thumb unconsciously traced the scar on his scope, the mark left by shrapnel from the mortar round that had nearly ended his war. His spotter Danny had pulled him from the rubble, scope damaged but still functional. They'd held that perimeter together until the birds could get their wounded out. And one more thing, Patterson added, his eyes finding Jackson's terrified face. In 1985 at this very range, Staff Sergeant Rivera set the 1,000-yard course record that stood for 27 years, a record that every Marine sniper since has tried and failed to break. General Hayes finally lowered her salute and turned her glacial stare on Jackson. Her voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. Each word carried the weight of absolute authority. Lance Corporal, you mocked his rifle. That rifle has more combat experience than your entire platoon combined. You mocked his age. That age was earned in jungles you can't imagine, fighting for the freedom that gives you the privilege to wear that uniform. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the range. You are hereby assigned to base archives. You will spend the next month cataloging service records, learning the stories of heroes whose boots you're not worthy to clean. Is that understood? Yes, ma'am, Jackson choked out, his face white as paper. Frank Rivera stepped forward, his weathered hand gently touching the general's starched sleeve. General, he said quietly, his voice carrying the soft authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak. The boy's young. We were all young once. He turned to face Jackson, and there was no anger in his dark eyes, only the deep, patient wisdom that comes from surviving what most people couldn't imagine. Son, Frank said, his voice gentle but clear enough for everyone to hear. This rifle, this scope, they're not about the technology, they're about respect. Respect for your equipment, respect for your mission, and most of all respect for the Marines who depended on you to do your job right. As his hand rested on the scarred scope, another memory surfaced with crystal clarity. Firebase, Charlie, 1969. His spotter Danny bleeding out from mortar shrapnel while enemy snipers closed in on their position. The scope had been damaged, its housing cracked, but Frank had kept shooting, kept the helicopters safe, kept his brothers alive. Danny's last words echoed across the decades. You did good, hermano, you kept the faith. A steady hand and a clear eye, Frank continued, tapping his chest. They don't come from a factory, they come from here, and from here. He tapped his temple. The man makes the rifle, not the other way around. General Hayes watched this exchange with something approaching awe. In 30 years of military service, she'd rarely seen such grace in the face of humiliation, such wisdom in response to ignorance. Staff Sergeant Rivera, she said formally, would you honor us by demonstrating what precision shooting really means? Frank nodded slowly, and walked back to his shooting mat. The crowd of Marines, including a deeply humbled Jackson, formed a silent semicircle behind the firing line. The range had been cleared, except for Frank, giving him the stage he'd never asked for but clearly deserved. He settled behind the M21 as if he were coming home. No dramatic adjustments, no calculated preparations, just the smooth, practiced ritual of a master craftsman approaching his work. The rifle seemed to melt into his shoulder, his breathing slowed to the rhythm of someone who'd learned to find calm in chaos. The vintage scope, scratched and scarred but lovingly maintained, showed him a target that existed not just as paper and ink, but as a problem to be solved with 40 years of accumulated knowledge. The shot came as naturally as breathing. The crack of the M21 echoed across the valley, followed by a silence so complete it seemed to press against the eardrums. Every Marine present held their breath, waiting for the target display to register the impact. When the numbers flashed on the electronic scoreboard, the silence broke with a roar that could be heard across the entire base. Not just a bullseye, a perfect shot that had gone through the exact center of the target with mathematical precision. But more than that, the computer registered something impossible. Frank Rivera had just broken his own 30. The thunderous applause that erupted from hundreds of Marines was more than appreciation for exceptional marksmanship. It was recognition of something larger, the moment when legend became reality, when history walked among them and proved that some things transcend time and technology. Frank slowly rose from his shooting position, the M21 cradled in his arms like something sacred. He looked around at the sea of young faces, all staring at him with a mixture of awe and newfound respect that he'd never sought but had certainly earned. Colonel Patterson approached with his tablet, consulting records that most of the Marines present didn't have clearance to read. Staff Sergeant, he said quietly, according to our files, you were supposed to be working maintenance here. What's the story? Frank's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. 30 years ago, when I retired from the Corps, base commander offered me a choice: pension and civilian life, or stay on base doing whatever work needed doing. Said there'd always be a place here for Marines who'd given everything. He gestured toward the custodial cart that still sat behind the firing line, its humble presence now seeming almost surreal. Figured keeping the place clean was a way to keep serving. Never expected to be back on the firing line. General Hayes shook her head in wonder. 30 years you've been here, and nobody knew who you were. Wasn't supposed to matter who I was, Frank replied simply. Was supposed to matter that the work got done. That young Marines had a clean place to train. That somebody who understood the cost was watching out for them. He looked directly at Jackson, who stood at rigid attention, his face still pale with shock and shame. Son, I want you to understand something. That rifle didn't make me a sniper. The Corps made me a sniper. The training, the discipline, the Marines who taught me everything I know, that's what made the difference. Jackson found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Staff Sergeant, I don't know what to say. I was completely wrong about everything. You were young and proud, Frank corrected gently. Same as I was at your age. Pride's not wrong, son, as long as it's tempered with respect for those who came before you. General Hayes consulted her watch, then addressed the assembled crowd. This demonstration will be incorporated into mandatory training for all sniper candidates. Staff Sergeant Rivera has agreed to serve as an advisor to our marksmanship program. She paused, her expression growing serious. But more than that, what happened here today serves as a reminder that heroes don't always announce themselves. They're often the quiet professionals doing the work that needs doing, maintaining the standards that keep us sharp. The crowd began to disperse, but many Marines lingered, hoping for a chance to speak with the legend they'd discovered among them. Frank fielded their questions with patient grace, sharing wisdom earned through experience that couldn't be taught in any manual. As the sun climbed higher over the California desert, Lance Corporal Jackson approached hesitantly. "Staff Sergeant Rivera," Jackson said, his voice carefully respectful, "I know I don't deserve to ask, but would you teach me, not just the shooting, how to be the kind of Marine you are?" Frank studied the young man for a long moment. The arrogance was gone, replaced by genuine humility and hunger to learn. It was the kind of transformation that gave an old Marine hope for the future. "Son, the first thing you need to understand is that being a good Marine isn't about being the best shot or having the newest equipment. It's about serving something bigger than yourself." He gestured toward the rifle range, where other Marines were still shooting, their modern equipment gleaming in the afternoon sun. "All this technology you've got now, it's incredible. Things I could only dream about when I was carrying that M21 through the jungle. But technology is just a tool. What matters is the Marine behind it." Over the following weeks, Frank began working with Jackson and other young Marines who sought him out. His lessons went far beyond marksmanship. He taught them patience, observation, the importance of maintaining their equipment not just for function, but out of respect for the tools their lives depended on. "This rifle," Frank would say, holding up the scarred M21, "has been with me for 40 years. I've cleaned it, maintained it, treated it like family because it earned that respect. It brought me home from a war that took too many good Marines." The young Marines learned that precision shooting was as much mental discipline as physical skill. Frank taught them to read environmental conditions that their ballistic computers couldn't calculate, to develop the kind of situational awareness that had kept him alive in places where a moment's inattention meant death. "Technology will fail you," he'd tell them during training sessions. "Batteries die, computers malfunction, scopes break. When that happens, you fall back on fundamentals, on training, on the discipline that makes you a Marine even when everything else strips away." Jackson proved to be his most dedicated student, arriving early and staying late, eager to absorb everything the old Marine could teach. The transformation was remarkable. From arrogant hotshot to thoughtful professional who understood that true expertise came from humility and constant learning. 3 months after the incident at the range, Jackson approached Frank with news. "Staff Sergeant, I've been selected for Scout Sniper School. My instructors say my fundamental skills have improved dramatically." Frank nodded approvingly. "Just remember, son, the school will teach you tactics and techniques, but being a Marine sniper is about more than that. It's about carrying the responsibility of life and death decisions, about being worthy of the trust your brothers place in you." He handed Jackson a small, worn notebook. "These are some observations I made over the years. Not official doctrine, just things I learned the hard way. Study them. But more importantly, understand that every Marine who came before you has lessons to teach if you're wise enough to listen." 1 year after the range incident that had changed everything, Frank Rivera found himself in an unexpected position, standing before a packed auditorium at the Marine Corps War College, addressing an audience of senior officers and master instructors. The invitation had come from the commandant himself, asking Frank to present his methods to the Corps' leadership. At 80, he was finally receiving the recognition that his decades of quiet service had earned. "Gentlemen," Frank began, his voice carrying easily to the back of the auditorium, "you've asked me to talk about marksmanship, but what I'm really here to discuss is value." He clicked to his first slide, not a complex ballistic chart or equipment diagram, but a simple photograph of young Marines training at the range where it all began. Every new generation of Marines thinks they've discovered something new, that their technology makes them superior to those who came before. But the fundamentals never change. Discipline, respect, dedication to something larger than yourself. The audience listened with rapt attention as Frank described methods that seemed almost philosophical but were based on solid understanding of what it meant to be a Marine. He spoke of patience earned through experience, of wisdom that couldn't be downloaded from a computer, of the responsibility that came with carrying weapons designed to take life. The danger, he continued, is that we're raising a generation of Marines who can operate computers but have forgotten why we serve, who focus on equipment instead of character, who mistake arrogance for confidence. After the presentation, a young captain approached Frank with a question that struck to the heart of everything he'd been trying to teach. Staff Sergeant, with all the advances in technology, what's the most important thing a modern Marine sniper needs to understand? Frank smiled, recognizing the same eagerness he'd seen in Jackson and countless other young Marines who'd sought his guidance. Son, the most important thing any Marine needs to understand is that this uniform comes with a debt to every Marine who wore it before you, who bled for it, who died for it. Technology can't pay that debt. Only service can. He paused, looking around the auditorium at faces representing the future of Marine Corps leadership. I spent 30 years in uniform, and 30 more years serving Marines in other ways. The proudest moment of my career wasn't any shot I made or any record I set. It was watching young Marines like Lance Corporal Jackson learn what it really means to be part of something eternal. The standing ovation lasted nearly 10 minutes. 6 months later, the Rivera method had been officially integrated into Marine Corps sniper training program. Frank found himself busier in his 80s than he'd been in decades, traveling between bases to train instructors who would carry his wisdom to the next generation. But perhaps his greatest satisfaction came from the quiet moments, when former students would visit, now seasoned Marines themselves, to share stories of how his lessons had guided them through their own challenges. 2 years after the incident that had transformed his retirement, Frank Rivera sat on the porch of his small house near Camp Pendleton, watching the sunset paint the California sky in shades of gold and crimson. At 81, he had officially retired from his retirement, his legacy secure in the hands of Marines who would carry his wisdom forward. The ceremony honoring his contribution to Marine Corps training had been simple but moving, exactly what Frank had requested. No fanfare, no media coverage, just a gathering of Marines who understood what he represented. Lance Corporal Jackson, now Sergeant Jackson, and a distinguished graduate of Scout Sniper School, was one of his regular visitors. The transformation in the young Marine had been remarkable, from arrogant technician to thoughtful leader who understood that teaching was as important as shooting. Staff Sergeant, Jackson said, settling into the chair beside him, I wanted to tell you something. Last month I had a new Marine in my unit who reminded me a lot of myself when we first met. Young, cocky, thought he knew everything. Frank nodded, encouraging him to continue. I remembered what you taught me about patience, about seeing potential instead of just problem. Instead of writing him off, I took the time to mentor him, to share some of the wisdom you shared with me. And, Frank asked, though he could see the pride in Jackson's eyes, he's turned into one of the finest Marines I've ever worked with. Says he wants to honor the tradition, to be worthy of those who came before him. Frank was quiet for a long moment, watching the hawks circle high overhead. That's the real legacy, son. Not the records we set, or the shots we make. It's the Marines we influence, who go on to influence others. It's the chain of service that connects every Marine to every other Marine, across time and distance. Jackson nodded thoughtfully. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about responsibility and tradition, about what it means to be part of something bigger than yourself. That's the lesson your generation needs to learn, Frank replied. Technology changes, equipment improves, tactics evolve, but the spirit of the Marine Corps, the commitment to honor courage and commitment, that's eternal. As darkness settled over the base, Frank reflected on the unexpected turn his retirement had taken. He'd spent 40 years in quiet service, content to maintain the facilities where new generations of Marines trained for challenges he hoped they'd never face. Now, through a confrontation he'd never sought and recognition he'd never desired, his knowledge had found new purpose. The old ways hadn't just survived, they'd proven essential for understanding what military service really meant. Sometimes, Frank thought, the best legacy isn't what you accomplish for yourself, but what you help others understand about honor, duty, and the quiet pride that comes from serving something greater than your own ambition. The rifle propped beside his chair, the scarred M21 that had been his companion through war and peace, caught the last rays of sunlight, its worn surfaces telling stories that would live on in the Marines he'd taught to listen.